Alright, so the path tracing update for Indiana Jones launched a few hours ago. Unfortunately, I'm only able to make a video now as we had huge storms. Anyway, so currently we are at 4K native resolution using TAA. We'll be testing with the RTX 4090, a 7800 X3D, and then also 32 gigabytes of DDR5 6000 mega transfers per second CL30 memory. Now, I just want to show you here, currently native GAA, no frame generation, no nothing. And then we had the addition of, or we have the addition of path tracing, right? Now we can enable a bunch of settings here. You can go into enable custom if you change a few of these settings. So we'll be testing just a bunch of them. Currently at 4K native, yeah, we're getting around 110 frames per second. But I just want to talk about one or two things here. Path tracing is not available on AMD GPUs. No matter what GPU you can have an XTX, a 7900 XTX, and you won't be able to enable path tracing, which is really kind of strange. Like it seems unnecessary. I know it's an Nvidia sponsored title, but I mean, give us the option at least. Because if I'm going to leave the frame rate counter up here because I just want to show you that I know that in AMD GPUs in the past have struggled with path tracing in games like Cyberpunk and Alan Wake, etc. But just look at the frame rate here. So we've got 112 frames per second in the menu. And if we go to full RT, that drops to 30 frames per second. Okay, so that's very rough. But if you disable reflections and RT indirect illumination, we're getting 63 frames per second here at native 4K. So we do have better shadows now. And we can see that the shadows flicker a lot less, and there's definitely a lot more detail. And this is also one of the more GPU heavy areas in this game. So AMD GPUs can definitely make use of some path tracing options here without the performance hit being too bad. But the other thing is we only have DLSS upscaling. So nothing has been catered here for AMD GPUs. I know that they said they are working on an update for FSR, but I'm not sure if that'll enable AMD users to use path tracing. It is very, very strange. As I said, I know it's an Nvidia sponsored title, but I do think I don't like it very much. Okay, so anyway, 100 and something frames per second here. Let me just get the baseline up again. So 108 frames per second here. Let's just cycle through the path tracing settings quickly. Let me show you what they do, and then we'll also test a bit at 1440p with some upscaling and frame generation, etc. So 106 frames per second here. I'm a little bit lost. So if we just kick it on to medium, the only option that gets enabled is sun shadows, and we are getting 60 frames per second here. Now 4K native, definitely not a bad experience. We're not able to maintain 60 frames per second in this specific spot. There are other areas where it runs a lot better. I'm actually in Gizeh in my playthrough, and we'll go there because it does not have all this foliage and shadows, light shafts, etc. So it is a little bit of a less demanding area, but you can see that the performance is stable, right? The lows are very good. The frame time graph is very good, even with path tracing enabled. I'm not going to do a full run with each of the settings. I'm just going to cycle through them, standing still in this specific spot. And I'm not sure if the image quality over YouTube will come across well, but maybe you can just I don't know, maybe it does. Maybe you can see the differences. So this is with medium path tracing. It's only sun shadows that are enabled now, and we're getting 63 frames per second. So I'm going to leave the frame rate counter up there in the top left hand corner because I don't think it is in the way. Remember, this is the supreme preset, and the VRAM usage is insane, sitting with 15.5 gigabytes of VRAM used at the moment. So if we kick it on to high, we have the addition of RT reflections. Now, I don't think there's anything to reflect in this specific spot here, but we dropped to 40 frames per second, and I don't think there's any reflective surfaces here, so I don't know why it is that heavy in this specific spot. Very strange. And then if we then go ahead and just enable the full path tracing again, as previously we got 30 frames per second, right? All right, so that then enables RT indirect illumination as well. So that increases the bounce lighting as far as I can see. Stuff being underneath the shadows, like underneath the trees, you can see a little bit more detail as bounce lighting reaches a little bit more underneath there. That's what I could see anyway. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but yeah, we are getting 30 frames per second here with the RTX 4090. So 4K native, right? It's 4K is already very, very heavy. And the spec sheet actually said with the 4090 and a 7900X, we should be getting 60 frames per second with DLSS performance and frame generation enabled. So let's just, I'm going to leave the frame rate counter up again because it does render the game in the background, right? It's just the CPU takes a bit of a dive when it comes to usages when you go into the menu, but the GPU works just as hard. You can see our GPU usage is sitting at 100% when we enable full path tracing here. So actually just want to show you, if we then enable DLSS here, so let's go with DLSS quality, that gets us 50 frames per second. Not enough in my mind for a game like this. That it's a first-person game, and I personally would need around 60 frames per second. I'd want 60 frames per second at least. And in this specific spot, we're not getting that. But in Gizeh, I think we should. Okay, so I think the 60 frames per second with DLSS performance and frame generation, I think that was them just overspeccing the spec sheet. So if we go to DLSS balance, let's leave all this up again. Sorry. So DLSS balanced, yeah. Let's see if we can get 60 frames per second. And that then takes us to 62 frames per second. Now I'm just going to run around a bit because we won't maintain 60 frames per second here, not in this spot anyway. But you don't need frame generation on the RTX 4090 to get 60 frames per second at 4K with full path tracing, as the spec sheet suggests. Okay, so they were probably just covering themselves, but I do think they definitely overspec, because over here, as I said, this is one of the most GPU demanding areas I've tested so far, and I've played around 10 hours or so. So the other areas are definitely a lot more CPU heavy. You can see our CPU usage sitting around 27%, and we'll go to Gizeh a bit later and I'll share the CPU usage there. But now we are hitting 60 frames per second in this demanding spot. So keep on pressing the wrong buttons here. So if we go and just enable the DLSS performance as they mentioned in the spec sheet, which way? This way. Nope. We do have ultra performance as well, so 720p. Performance is 1080p internal render resolution. So DLSS performance here, and now we are getting well above 60 frames per second. I'd say we've got around 10% headroom. Let's see if it maintains 60 frames per second, 61, 62. And might drop below 60 frames per second every now and again, but I do think DLSS performance here is enough to get us 60 frames per second consistently, or maybe 99% of the time. Okay, so we'll go back to DLSS quality, 53 frames per second, and then we'll enable DLSS frame generation. And in the menu, frame generation does not kick in, and now we have 80 frames per second, but the input latency is very, very noticeable. It's quite bad actually. The frame time graph is not as smooth as without frame generation for some reason in this game, and also the Xbox Game Pass version of the game runs better than the Steam version when it comes to the lows and the frame times. But I think, I'm not sure if that's fixed now with the latest patch, that it was the case previously in early access. All right, so 77 frames per second frame generation. Moving the camera around just to test the input latency, it's pretty bad. Okay, I would not recommend playing this like this. Okay, so I'm just going to come back here. So 80-ish frames per second with frame generation enabled. I keep on pressing the wrong buttons. So let's go and enable DLSS balanced here quickly. I think that 6 frames per second or so that we gain might sound trivial, but that's around 10%, right? So we went from 54 to 59 frames per second by enabling DLSS balance. We still have DLSS frame generation enabled. And now we get 90-ish frames per second, and the input latency is definitely better, which is, I know it sounds counterintuitive. We went from 80 to 90 frames per second, or 75 to 85 frames per second, but the input latency is definitely much better. Still kind of high for a first-person game, although I personally don't shoot that much in this game. I just use objects and my whip, so it's, I think it should be fine. Although for me personally, I'd prefer a little bit of a higher base frame rate to start off with. All right, so that was a DLSS balanced with a frame generation. So let's see DLSS performance here, and that's the only one that maintained 60 frames per second previously, all right, with full path tracing enabled. So we'll go with DLSS performance and base frame rate of 68 frames per second. And if we start our, I'm going to count the lows as well. It's definitely, I think this is acceptable, although we're rendering internally at 1080p. And it might show somewhere, right? You might see some issues come up visually anyway. I personally remember, everything I say is personal opinion, right? This is not fact. These are not all recommendations, right? I'm just saying what I think. And I think DLSS performance at 4K is a little bit too aggressive for me personally. I know that Nvidia recommends or suggests performance at 4K. I personally don't like using performance. I'll use balanced at the most at 4K. But there you have it, 100 and something frames per second DLSS performance and frame generation enabled, whereas its spec sheet said 60 frames per second. So we can at least put that to rest, because this is fine. Okay. All right. So let's go, and I'm not going to test all the DLSS presets with all of the different path tracing options here. So we were getting 100 and something frames per second. Yeah, I keep on scrolling past it. So let's just see the high path tracing settings. So no RT indirect illumination, and see what we get here. So now we're getting, let me just do that. So we just want to do a frame rate comparison. So we gained around 10-ish frames per second, right? We were sitting just above 100, and now we're sitting at just above 110. And then if we go ahead and enable the medium preset here, let's see, now this disables RT reflections, and our base frame rate now all of a sudden is 105 frames per second again. Okay, and now we're getting 130 something frames per second. Remember, it's still DLSS performance, so you can definitely now start using DLSS quality probably. And then lastly, let's just try the low preset, which only enable, no, that'll be off. So there's only medium, high, and full. Right. Okay, so there we have it, at 4K at least. So let's just go through the options at 1440p quickly, and then I just want to show you Gizeh as well. All right, so we are at 1440p now, and no full path tracing, no upscaling, no nothing, and we are getting 140, 150 something frames per second. The frame rate is slightly lower than my previous video for some reason, like not a lot, maybe 5-10 frames per second, but now it's back up to 155. I don't know. Anyway, so 155 frames per second without any path tracing. I'll link my previous video in the comment section. And then if we go ahead, and so we're still native TIA, right? Sure, we can do DLAA, but DLAA does have a little bit of a performance hit here. So I just want to test with TIA first, and then we'll do the DLSS presets and whatnot. Okay, so let's go through the settings here. Medium drops us down to 90 frames per second. Still perfectly playable, I think. So this is personally how I'd play it, right? We've got much better shadows, and we still have decent performance. But RT reflections would probably be nice as well, except RT reflections very heavy. Okay, so I know reflections are typically very heavy, but not in the specific scene. I don't know where the reflections come from. So if we go to the high preset here, so it's 67 frames per second base frame rate, then we've got sun shadows and reflections enabled. So maybe this is possible, right? So I'm going to do a quick run here, see if we can maintain 60, although I doubt it. Probably drop into 55. There we go, 55 frames per second. So DLSS quality 1440p should maintain around 80 frames per second. I'm guessing. Okay, so we're not able to maintain 60 frames per second in this spot. Okay, and it's not a terrible experience. The input latency is definitely pretty good because we don't have any frame generation. Yeah, base frame rate is 60 frames per second. It's fine. It's not great. It's fine. Okay, so 61 frames per second average here with the whichever path tracing setting we've got here. And then the one that I actually made a Twitter post about, I'll not call it X. We've got full RT. We go from 155 frames per second to 55 frames per second. Okay, so that's heavy. That is very heavy. Yes, path tracing is heavy, but now it seems like the foliage looks a little bit more blurry. I'm not sure if it is because the light might be shining through them a little bit more, but the foliage definitely looks a little bit more blurry than without all the path tracing options. Now, ray reconstruction is not an option you can enable in the options menu, but seeing that you can only use Nvidia GPUs with path tracing or path tracing with Nvidia GPUs, I kind of think it gets enabled by default, right? Because they did say that it will support array reconstruction in one of the earlier posts a few months ago. But seeing that we don't see a setting for it in the menu, I'm inclined to believe that either it's not there or it's enabled by default. Okay, so 55 frames per second here. So let's see if we... sorry, I just want to see the VRAM usage here. So 15 gig. That's rough, right? So even on a 4080, you're going to have to make some concessions here. You're going to start running out of VRAM. I've heard people talk about that on the Supreme preset with full RT. Even at 1440p, they start running out of VRAM. All right, so let's go with DLSS quality first. And I think, as I said earlier, we should be able to hit 80, and we're not maintaining 80. I kind of wished we'd be able to maintain 80 frames per second here. And I know I received comments previously. Sure, this is a 4090 with a 7800X3D, one of the fastest systems that you can build, right? The fastest GPU anyway. That's not the point of the video, and I'm not here to tell you, oh, it runs fine on a 4090. I'm just here to show you what the game can run like, and with the max hardware, and then you can decide from there on whether it'll be worth it or not. Because as you can see, we took a 65% hit to our frame rate on a 4090 when we enabled path tracing at native resolution. That's a big hit, right? And that should be more or less the same, or maybe slightly more on lower GPUs, like I'm not don't want to say lower GPUs down the stacks like the 4080 and 4070. The performance impact might be a little bit more, but it's just to give you an idea of what the game can perform like, right? Anyway, so DLSS quality, let's just see this 80 frames per second balanced. I'm going to try and get 100 frames per second. We're not going to get 100 frames per second unless we go to DLSS performance, right? Okay, so but we do still have the option of a ray tracing, a frame generation. So 80-ish frames per second. This is what I kind of expected DLSS quality, to be honest. And DLSS balanced is pretty much as far as I'll go, even at 1440p. I did mention that at 4K as well. I do start seeing some visual artifacts here in the underbrush. That's what you call it. I think the reconstruction is starting to create some kind of shimmer here. Not sure if it's only related to path tracing, but see that's why I'm not really... I don't really like DLSS balanced at 1440p that much. I'd prefer quality, but if needs be, I'll go down to balance, but nothing more than balanced. All right, so 86 frames per second there, 85 frames per second average actually. So then if we go down to DLSS performance, just to give you an idea, right? I don't think we should use DLSS performance here. So that then gets us to 102 frames per second. So DLSS performance at 1440p, okay, now it looks kind of bad. remember this is 720p internal resolution. I'm not going to do a full run. So 96 frames per second DLSS performance, still sitting at 14 gigabytes of VRAM used, right? So let's go to DLSS quality and then just enable frame generation, because we were able to maintain above 60 frames per second at all times, right? And personally, this is where I'd want to aim to play the game, with frame generation enabled. Input latency is fine, above 100 frames per second. And sure, once again, it's 4090. We're getting 100 frames per second at 1440p. But DLSS quality, so like it's even lower than 1080p internal resolution, and frame generation is enabled. So you have to decide for yourself whether the performance impact is worth it to you. I was expecting around 120 frames per second with these settings on the 4090. If I were to get that, I would have used these settings to play myself, but I'm an FPS snob, and this is not cutting it for me. Fast tracing is just way too heavy. All right, so as I said, DLSS quality, I think with the frame generation is probably a good place to start, although let's just see what DLSS balance with frame generation looks like. I don't think so. Now we're getting 120 frames per second, basically what I expected at DLSS quality, but once again, definitely a lot more shimmering. I do apologize if you can't see it in the YouTube video. I have to record the YouTube video at 1440p and then upscale it to 4K for YouTube. My recording PC's GPU is not that well at the moment. It's a 750 Ti, so it does struggle a bit, usually at 4K recordings, but lately I think it just kicked the bucket, because it won't even start recording at 4K without OBS crashing. All right, so 120 frames per second average, decent, worth it, I don't know. That's up to you to decide. It's not worth it to me anyway. So let's just see. I'm going to go back to DLSS quality, right? And then let me keep that up and get rid of that. So I'm going to go back to DLSS quality with frame generation enabled. Okay, so 83 frames per second, and then we'll just test the different presets here quickly. Oh, so high without any indirect illumination. That gets us to 120 frames per second, and I think this is okay, considering where we started. I think that's decent. And then also, if we test the medium preset, as I said, this is probably what I'd use. Depending on whether reflections are heavier in other areas. But let's see. So sun shadows are enabled, so we do have better shadows, and that's basically all that we add here, getting a base frame rate of 120 frames per second, and then 145 frames per second with frame generation enabled, 130-ish. It should stay above 120 at all times, and you do get the benefit of much better shadows, I do think. Now, I think the game still has a lot of pop-in issues. Definitely still has pop-in issues. You can fix that with an LOD scale command, although it doesn't seem to work for me. I don't see a difference when I do that on the Xbox Game Pass version. Maybe on the Steam version it works a little bit better. All right, so I'm just going to load my other save and just jump to Gizeh just to give you an idea what the performance is like. I'm just going to do a quick test at 1440p to show you the performance of different areas. All right, so we are in Gizeh now, and the reason why I want to test this area is because we have it's definitely a lot more CPU bound. I'll show you the CPU usages, but let's start off with full RT and no DLSS. So just TIA. Sure, we can use the LAA. That gives you better image quality, DLSS quality as well. But I just want to. We've got a base frame rate to work with anyway. So over here in Gizeh, we are getting 70. 60, 80 frames per second, and that is because of the lack of vegetation. We did see a bit of a spike there in the frame time, but just look at our CPU usages are very low now. Okay, previously when I tested in this area, we were seeing around like 95% of the CPU being used, with all the cores being hit above 90%. So Maybe they fixed that a little bit, or maybe it's just the frame rate is now low enough that it does the CPU doesn't need to work as hard. All right, so you can see here that 1440p native, we are able to stay above 60 frames per second, seeing even 80 frames per second at times. Now, I'm not sure if this will maintain it. I literally just arrived in Gizeh. If we go a little bit further, although this is Egypt in the desert, I don't think there's going to be much vegetation, right? Okay, so 80-ish frames per second. And then if we go ahead, I'm just going to do DLSS quality and then DLSS frame generation with full RT enabled in the specific spot. We already got an idea of what the performance is like otherwise, right? It's just to show you that performance does differ in different areas, obviously. So DLSS quality, getting us 102 frames per second. It'll probably just maintain above 90 frames per second at all times, I think, based on what we saw earlier. So, and DLSS quality at 1440p still, it really looks pretty good. Okay, so 90 something frames per second, not going to waste too much time here. And then enable frame generation at these settings. See if we, where are we now? Just want to see if we can at like 120 plus at all times. So 132. So remember, we were getting much less than this in the denser forest area, and it makes a lot of sense. So now we might have some reflections. Is there enough water for reflections here? The desert is probably the worst place to start looking for reflections, right? I see some light reflections, and so I can't confirm nor deny whether ray reconstruction is actually enabled. We'll need somebody to do an NV profile inspector, whatever it's called, to tell us whether ray reconstruction is enabled, looking at your average croissant. Okay, so 132 frames per second average. This is actually perfectly fine. In movement, the power lines, are these power lines or telephone lines? I mean, it's the 1930s, so it could be either. They do seem to break up a little bit, become a little bit more jaggy. Anyway, bit of a spike there, but overall the performance in this area is actually okay, and the CPU usages are much better as well. We are CPU bound. You can see that our GPU usage is sitting at 93%, and our GPU power is only sitting at around 300 and something, 290 watt. So definitely a little bit more CPU bound here. I'm going to disable full path tracing here just to give you an idea once again what the actual performance is like. I'm going to go back to DLSS native TAA and no frame generation. I just want to see if the CPU usages. So there we go. You want to fight? That's what I thought. So look at the CPU usages now. 100, getting the same frame rate as previously without frame generation and DLSS, and our CPU is sitting at 86% usage. Okay, so they didn't really fix it. It's just if you enable path tracing, it seems that even if we do start seeing the same frame rate with upscaling and frame generation enabled, it seems to do a lot better on the CPU side. So let's just test that through once again, full RT. Sure, I know that obviously if the frame rate is lower, the CPU usages would be lower as well. That makes sense. But if we try and get more or less the same frame rate, so go with DLSS balance, DLSS frame generation enabled. So still 140 something frames per second. Now it's CPU usage is sitting at 45%. Okay. So sure, they generated frames, so it might just be that the CPU is not really working as hard. But it's actually the first game I personally noticed it. Maybe it does the same in other games. I just did not notice it. Alright, so I think before we end World War II all on our own, or prevent the start of World War II all on our own, I'm going to leave you guys here. Just one correction. I just got confirmation that on 30 series GPUs, 12 gigabytes or higher, you can enable full path tracing. Alright, so that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you guys on the next one.